Good afternoon and welcome to our mid-afternoon surge, which is going to be our panel on responsible defense in a changing world. This panel is built on the research work that we've done at CNAS over about the last year that culminated in two reports, one of which called Hard Choices we published in early October last year, aimed at the super committee's deliberations in Congress. And then our newest report on the table outside, Sustaining Preeminence. So we would invite you to snag a copy of that on your way out if you haven't seen that already. And today we'll talk about aspects of this, and are happy to go into some details in our Q&A from the audience later on. But our broader discussion will take advantage of our panel here today, which is a unique and distinguished one. We're going to break this up with about 30 minutes of panel discussion, essentially a conversation between us here on the stage, and then follow with about 45 minutes of questions and answers from you, the audience. So have your questions ready to go, and we'll get through as many of them as we can. We're going to reserve a good bit of time for that. At the very end of our panel today, we're going to ask the panelists to give you their boldest predictions for the next 12 months. So you can hold them accountable for that later by name. So consider writing those down when you hear them. And I think you'll hear some pretty interesting things. So to begin with, let me introduce the panel itself. I'm Dave Barno. I'm a senior fellow and senior advisor at the Center for New American Security for about the last 2 years. Director of the Near East South Asia Center at NDU before that, and then 30-year military officer, former commander in Afghanistan from 1976 to 2006. On our panel here today, to my right, I've got the Honorable Dov Zakheim, who is currently a senior advisor for the Center for Strategic International Studies and also a senior fellow at the Center for Naval Analyses. Dr. Zakheim is also probably best known, I think, for his time in government as the Undersecretary of Defense Comptroller and Chief Financial Officer for the Defense Department during the middle of the last decade, and I worked with him in that capacity when I was in Afghanistan. To my far left, Michèle Flournoy, also a recent survivor of time in government and a multiple offender in that department, as well as Dov. Michèle, of course, coming from a position as the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, currently a member of the CNAS Board of Directors, and most close to our heart in CNAS, one of our founding directors and the Center's president from our inception. So it's great to have Michèle back on the panel here today with CNAS. And finally, to my immediate left, one of the co-authors on our latest Responsible Defense report, along with Travis Sharp and Matt Irvin, Dr. Nora Bensahel, who is also a senior fellow at the Center for New American Security and our Deputy Director of Studies. Nora spent many years at the RAND Corporation as a senior political scientist before joining us at CNAS. She's also an adjunct associate professor in security studies at Georgetown University. We're going to be doing a little bit of Huntley-Brinkley. For those of you that don't remember what that is, it'll become apparent. Just looking at this crowd, that's probably 70% of you have no idea what I'm talking about. So it'll be back and forth between Nora and I a bit on questions, and we'll, again, shape this a bit as a conversation here for the first part of the program and then turn to you for some questions. So, Nora.
I want to start out with a very fundamental question, and that has to do with what the U.S. role in the world should be, because so many of the other issues surrounding the future of the Defense Department follow from that. This morning in the Grand Strategy panel, we heard a range of possible views of what the U.S. role in the world should be, ranging from U.S. primacy all the way to retrenchment. But I'm wondering if each of you could talk a little bit about what you see the U.S. role in the world to be going forward, and then particularly what and how the Department of Defense should contribute to that. And we thought we'd start with you, Michèle.
Great. Well, it's good to see everybody here today. And I think you're starting with the right question, because I think how you answer that question should inform how we think about defense spending, the utilization of the military tool, and so forth. For my part, I believe that the U.S. still has a unique and indispensable leadership role to play in the world. We remain a global power with global interests. We remain uniquely indispensable in the sense that I think it's only with U.S. leadership that allies can be brought together, coalitions can be formed to deal with the kind of challenges we face today. When you look across the board, whether it's terrorism, proliferation, climate change, I mean, you name it, there's no one nation that can deal with those challenges by themselves. It requires a united international community. And I think the U.S. can and must play that leadership role. When we don't play it, things don't go so well for the international system and for meeting our shared interests. So I acknowledge that the relative indices of power are changing, and there are other countries that are rising in their power, both economically and militarily. But still, even in that context, I think for the coming decades, the U.S. will have a unique leadership role to play. And to answer your second part of your question, I think making sure that our military remains the best military in the world and acknowledged as such is a key part of our being able to exercise our influence effectively.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. And I would point out to Dave and to all of you, I don't mind being acknowledged as being on your right, but I wouldn't call Michèle far left.
I was going to object to that too. I thought I'd let it
I'm in general agreement with Michèle on this. Dave was worried we'd be in too much of agreement. Don't worry about that. The challenge for us, I think, is this. We are the necessary condition for success in a lot of places. We are not the sufficient condition. And in the past, we've often been the sufficient condition. And when we say we're indispensable, it almost implies that nothing can really go on without us, which simply isn't true. There are lots of things that can go on without us, and I would argue there are some things that go on better without us. Nation building. We are a disaster at nation building. We have had 4 successes since World War II. 2 countries which we flattened first, Japan and Germany, and 2 countries where we tolerated dictatorships for about 3 decades, Taiwan and Korea. I can give you a much longer list of our failures. Does that mean we shouldn't be involved in nation building? Of course it doesn't mean that. It does mean that we shouldn't necessarily take the lead. So when we say we're indispensable, it implies that we always have to be at the front. We always have to be getting everybody together. I'm not sure. But we are a necessary condition. It's very hard to see too many efforts succeeding without us being a part, and very often, most often, a significant part. Which brings me to the second part of the question. What should DOD be all about? And I personally believe that DOD should get out of the nation-building business. I don't think we're terribly successful taking a bunch of 18, 19, 20-year-olds and having them bring democracy to the great unwashed. Now, the fact is, those 18, 19, 20-year-olds do a phenomenal job considering that they weren't exactly trained to do this. But again, our success rate isn't particularly high. It's not what they enlist for. It's not what they're trained to do. And I don't believe it's what they should be trained to do. Now, there are other departments in our government that could probably do some of these things a lot better, and they have fallen very far short. But that doesn't mean defense should always be the default mechanism every time we have to do something like nation building. I think it's a huge mistake.
I would maybe take us in a little different direction here. And first, I'd point out there are Americans, and there's probably not a great number of them in this room, but I think listening to this morning's panel, it's worth noting that there are Americans who have a bit of a different view of the U.S. role in the world. And they are much more interested in the inward focus of our resources. They look at and as we heard in some of the panel discussion this morning, they look at the internal decay we see in a lot of our infrastructure, our capabilities, our systems, and they worry about that opportunity cost of what we're paying for defense right now as they look at what they see as crying needs here in the United States. So I'll look for opportunities, in a sense, as a devil's advocate to bring that out here this afternoon. But despite the fact that may not be a majority opinion in the room, there are a lot of Americans that are looking at that, and they're looking at the defense budget, and they're scratching their heads a little bit. And so as I look towards the next question here, I think I would suggest that we're on the cusp of really reshaping our Defense Department coming out of the last 10 years of war, and now seeing some significant budgetary constraints as a forcing function that will in effect force us to build the next DOD. And if we look back over the last 50 or 60 years, the Defense Department we have today in many ways was built on a threat-based situation, threat-based global scenario after World War II. The United States built its defense establishment for the first time, a large peacetime establishment based upon the threat that emerged in 1946, 47, 48 from the Soviet Union. And for the better part of 45 years, the U.S. had a very large expenditure rate on defense, had a global military for the first time in its history outside of an active war, and put a tremendous amount of resources into the defense establishment. By the early 90s, that threat had disappeared. And the Defense Department was downsized a bit, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well in our history there. But we really are still living with the legacy Defense Department that came out of that threat from the Cold War. And we shifted, however, in the 90s when I was still on active duty from a threat-based approach to really an opportunities or capabilities-based approach in the Defense Department, kind of little noted in the general public. So today we still have very large Defense Department. We have a budget that's extraordinarily significant, that's impacting other choices that the U.S. is making, but we don't have the threats. So as we look at the world today, what threats are we building this next Defense Department to be capable of dealing with? You noted that nation building may not be one of those. What else do we need to worry about?
Well, fair enough, but first I think people very often misunderstand the relative size of the defense budget relative to everything else that we spend in any given year. Because, as everybody knows now, the sequester involves 50% defense, 50% non-defense. A lot of people assume, well, half of what we spend is on defense. In fact, if you factor in what we spend on Social Security, Medicare, and all these entitlements, defense is actually 14%, which is quite different. And that tells you something about the relative nature of our expenditures on non-defense efforts since World War II. It used to be that defense was indeed the biggest single government item for expenditure. It was. That is far from the case today. So that's one point that I think needs to be made, because when a lot of people say, well, we should spend less on defense, we're spending so much, relatively speaking, that isn't exactly correct. Secondly, it's true that we've gone away from a threat-based approach, but you have to think about the negative consequences of withdrawal from the world. We are, as everybody knows, part of the center, maybe, the epicenter of the globalized economy. What happens if we withdrew back to our own borders? What would that do for stability in all sorts of parts of the world where we have major investments, where we have created jobs at home here? The odds are you'll see a lot more Syrias and a lot more Libyas. Part of what we have done over the last 60 years, even if we didn't fight a war with the Soviets, and even if we built up our forces in order to be able to fight a war if we had to, was provide stability. Even the Chinese never wanted us to leave the Pacific, and they're still of two minds in that regard. So the way to evaluate defense and its contribution is not simply to say, well, how many planes can we shoot down on any given day? It's what does our defense posture, and no one else has it, Michèle said this, nobody else can match that. What does our defense posture do for international stability, for the credibility of the entire international system? And in that regard, I would agree, we are indispensable. You pull us out of that system, the system collapses. The system collapses, you watch our economy head south very quickly.
Michèle, agree?
That's actually what I meant by being the indispensable power. It's not being all things to all people in all places. It is being that linchpin in the international system, and really it's about smart engagement. you know, I think that if you're going to figure out how much we need to spend on defense, it has to be a strategy-driven exercise, but it also needs to be informed by our larger resource picture. I think Secretary Panetta had it right when he said, we don't have to choose between national security and fiscal responsibility. While what you said is right, Dov, about the percentage of, you know, defense spending is of the overall budget, it's second to Social Security, it's the largest single chunk. It's about 20% of the federal budget, more than 50% of the discretionary budget. And you also have to put it in the context of unfettered, you know, very substantial growth in the last 10 years. Since 9/11, the budget has gone up, the defense budget has gone up by about 73% in real terms. That's very substantial growth, which has frankly been necessary to support the operations we've been in, to support the adaptation to new threats and so forth. But I think the kinds of reductions that are envisioned in the Budget Control Act, which was supported by a bipartisan vote in Congress, including all of the relevant leadership of the committees, that's the sort of thing that I think, you know, there's some hard choices to be made, but we can live within those parameters and still come out of the exercise with the best military in the world. I think in terms of setting priorities, the strategic guidance of the department, which although I'm now no longer an official, it's near and dear to my heart. It was one of my last acts to try to shape that. I think we got it right in terms of very clear priorities. A clear priority on Asia Pacific for the future, while making sure that we don't forget to sustain our engagement in the Middle East, given the volatility and the stakes involved in that region, and that we still make good on our commitments to our allies in Europe. But it was probably the clearest articulation of real priorities for the department in a long time.
I wanted to talk a little bit about these budget questions in some more detail, because they're so key moving forward, particularly with the looming implementation of sequestration at the beginning of the year. You gave us some really good numbers on the growth of the Defense Department over the past decade, which has obviously been considerable. Unfortunately, at the same time, as we all know, the national debt has grown quite substantially as well. At the end of 2008, the federal debt held by the public equaled about 40% of US GDP, and by the end of 2012, it's going to surpass 70% of GDP. That's the highest percentage since shortly after World War II. The federal debt held by the public now exceeds $11 trillion, and it has grown by $4.5 trillion just since the end of 2008. So obviously, and I know you were very aware of this as a senior policymaker, that fiscal context is very different from when we've had these types of decisions before. So the question that I want to pose to you, and you started answering this a little bit, but how much defense is enough in this fiscal context? And how do you prioritize among competing priorities, not just the trade-offs within the Department of Defense, but at the national level as well?
You're looking at me first, so okay. First of all, I think, again, you need to place defense in context. Right now, interest rates are at historic lows. Our debt, national debt, is roughly, what, 80% now of our GDP, give or take? The bottom line is, if our interest rates go up 1%, you're talking roughly $60 billion, maybe $70 billion added to the federal deficit. If we go up to our historic rates of about 4%, you have just eaten away roughly half of the defense budget. So, you know, the key isn't to say, well, on a budget of trillions, we get rid of, you know, the defense budget or a huge chunk of the defense budget. I just don't think that that's the solution. We know that there are other things that need to be done. But within defense itself, I'm not entirely convinced that defense can live within the $487 billion that are being cut over the next 10 years. We'll get to the sequester later. You know, we all have our hair on fire regarding that one. But if you want to talk about defense, then you have to really talk about what the problem is with defense. And the problem fundamentally is we've been spending more and getting less. We have fewer ships, we have fewer aircraft, we have fewer Army weapons systems when the Army can actually come up with one. That is the fundamental problem. And so you have to ask yourself why that is. Why it is, for example, that the Marine Corps in the next few years is going to spend 70% of its entire budget on personnel. And the answer is pretty obvious. We have significantly increased pay and benefits for active personnel. We have expanded the pay and benefits for reserve personnel. And particularly, of course, defense health, which comes out of the operations and maintenance budget, among others. Retirement has not been reformed. You retire at the age of 40 and then you're paid for 50 more years while you're holding down another job for perhaps 25 of those. In addition to that, the acquisition system, you could fill this room with the studies about how to fix the acquisition system. But the acquisition system has not been fixed. The only thing that's happened to the acquisition system is that we've added more acquirers. We've got lots of people doing acquisition. We don't have a lot of people doing it effectively. And then there's a whole question of whether we need as many defense civilians as we have. That's a very, very explosive question. But the Defense Business Board, which I'm happy to say I was the one who created it, came out with a study that said we could do with 110,000 less civilians. That's a lot of people and a lot of money. So it's not impossible to live within budget constraints. It's what you do in order to live with them. And in my view, and then I'll shut up here so Michèle can speak, in my view, we are really cutting significantly back on the capabilities, on the actual capabilities we have. The most graphic in many ways is the Navy. We're going to be focusing on Asia. I won't use the term pivot out of courtesy to Michèle because the administration doesn't like the term, but we'll focus on Asia, but we're going to focus on them with fewer ships. And if the sequester happens, we'll have even fewer ships than that. We don't want to lose sight of the Middle East, but where are we going to find the ships for those? We're going to have ships in the Mediterranean, and yet the numbers just don't add up. And the same applies to the Air Force. And ask any European what they think about pulling 2 brigades out of Europe, particularly when demonstrators in Moscow are being shoved into jails. There's a lot of angst out there. So there is a way, I believe, to manage the resource constraints that are being imposed in the defense budget, but again, A, understand this in context of the larger expenditures we have to deal with, and B, understand it in the context of what can be done inside defense that can really get you more for your money as opposed to where we are now where we get less for our money.
Where to begin? Let's start with the national debt piece. I mean, I really believe, and I think, frankly, most Americans believe that the only way we're going to grapple with this problem is to both increase revenues and further constrain spending. That is the common sense approach. It all has to be on the table to get there. And frankly, the national debt, the problem is so severe, I think it can become a national security issue in that the foundation of our power as the United States is really economic first and foremost. And so we've got to get after this issue. Defense does have to be on the table, but let's be clear about what the Budget Control Act numbers actually mean. $487 billion over 10 years. That is not, I mean, what it is actually doing is slowing the growth in the base budget. It's not actually reducing the numbers. It's reducing numbers, but it's not cutting in absolute terms. It is basically saying the base budget is going to grow by about 9% less than was originally planned. But it still goes up over time. It's also counting on recapturing or bringing down a lot of costs associated with the wars. The war in Iraq is now over. Afghanistan, we're in a transition process that is going to naturally bring those costs down. So I believe that the kinds of reductions envisioned in the Budget Control Act are things we can live with and still, again, have the defense we need to maintain our leadership position and protect and advance our interests and those of our allies. You know, I agree with Dov that, you know, you really do have to get inside why is it, what are we spending on, and why is it so hard and so frustrating to get what we need, the value out of that we need out of the defense budget. And I think we're at a point where we really have to think about fundamentally re-architecting and redesigning some of our business processes. You take personnel costs. What's driving the growth in personnel costs? Personnel went up by about 8%. Personnel costs in the same period since 2001 went up 40% above inflation. I mean, huge growth. it's healthcare. It's what's eating us alive in terms of our nation. So instead of having the toxic political discussion about, well, let's solve the healthcare cost problem by cutting benefits to those people who've been out there sacrificing day after day for the American people for the last 10 years, why don't we take the smarter approach to say, how do we re-architect our approaches to get same or better value for lower costs? That's what's starting to happen in the private sector. You can find examples of it out there. Why don't we go after military health care from that perspective as well?
Let me just add one thing on the military healthcare point. It's not just a matter of healthcare costs have increased in a parallel to the civilian society. It's also that the incentive structure is there for retirees to stay on military healthcare systems because they are so much less expensive in terms of the premiums than civilian health insurance is. I know one of the things that was proposed in the president's recent budget were relatively small increases in the fees for TRICARE, for example, which would have helped close that incentive gap to raise the fees by a relatively small percentage. Right now, the difference between the healthcare premiums, if you're on TRICARE, it's about 10% of what the equivalent cost is for a civilian. And so if you don't rebalance those incentives, that's going to continue going up. It's not just the healthcare cost itself.
Absolutely.
And this is a problem that's we've all faced it. I remember testifying when I had already left government, but with David Chu when the Bush administration was still in the White House. And we go to testify about just raising the copays. Copays have not been raised in how many years, Michèle? 15, something like that. It's ridiculous. And what they did was they stacked the letters from veterans associations that were generated. And you could barely see the congressman because the letters were covering our... this is a fundamental problem. And unless we do something about copays, look, there are at least 6 states that encourage their military retirees to stay with TRICARE so that they don't have to pay pensions. And there's something wrong with this. Sorry I interrupted you, Michèle.
No, that's right. At the risk of being an out-of-control panelist that you can't get to shut up, I did want to address your point about the Navy.
Okay.
Just to be clear with some, kind of the facts on the Navy. At the end of the Clinton administration, first of all, we have to think about what is the right metric for measuring naval strength. Is it really just the number of ships? I would argue not, given that the ships of today have a lot more capability than the ships of 1918 or what have you. But if you are going to look at numbers, at the end of the Clinton administration, the Navy had about 316 ships. By 8 years later, at the end of the Bush administration, it had 278. Since Obama has come in, 42 additional ships have been put on contract with the option for 15 more. So how are we using these forces? And the global posture review that's been done and the rebalancing towards Asia, we put a lot of time and effort to say, how can you take a force that will be somewhat smaller than it has been in the past and still create the sense that America is fully present. We maybe even seem to be more present because more things are going to be forward stationed, so that you can, with forward stationing, you can get, frankly, more presence for fewer ships than if you were trying to rotate them from CONUS all the time. We're doing that in Asia, we're doing it in Europe, and so forth. And the same thing with forces in Europe. Yes, we're taking one brigade out, but we're increasing the U.S. commitment to the NATO response force. We're going to rotate a battalion through on a regular basis for continued training with allies and coalition partners. So again, in terms of the actual experience of the U.S. being present, it should be comparable to what it's been in the past, if not enhanced. So I think it really matters how you manage the force, how you operate the force is as important as the sort of raw numbers.
One last point to hit briefly before we go to your questions, and that's the looming train wreck coming to town in December of this year in the Defense Department, sequestration. And I would ask you to draw out why, for this audience, why it really is so bad. If I look at the simple numbers, sequestration takes effect, it's perhaps a 10% cut across the board. It's going to be applied in some very problematic ways, obviously, but as I look at previous drawdowns, and we're going to do a study on this to come out next June on lessons learned from our previous American and other nations' drawdowns, those numbers are modest compared to 25, 30, 35% defense cuts at the end of the Cold War, at the end of the first Gulf War there, post-Vietnam, et cetera. So tell us why this is more problematic than drawdowns we've seen in the past.
Actually, I was going to defer to the former comptroller first, give you the right.
Does that mean I have to defer to you on every policy question?
Yes, it does.
It's a clever move.
Nicely done.
She's good. She's good.
She's very good. So I won't talk about the Navy right now. First of all, I think people don't realize we're not talking about a 10% cut. We're talking probably about a 15% cut. And the reason I say that is that everybody expects the White House has signaled that military personnel will be exempted. And as you just heard from both of us, that is a huge chunk of the budget. So that's number one. Right now, Jack Lew in the White House and OMB are saying that the Overseas Contingency Account, the OCO as it's called, will not be exempted. But Senator McCain and others have made it very, very clear that it will be exempted. So those two are going to be exempted. That's a chunk of change right there. And what it means is that you now have to find roughly $55 billion with fewer dollars in the denominator. That's how you come to your roughly 15%. But there's more. For a start, the 15% comes off what's called programs, projects, and activities. And that means that you go all the way deep down into the budget and you cut across the board. Now, there are going to be some problems. How do you cut 15% of a military building that you're building? Lop off the top 2 floors? It's just not clear. That means that contracting officers don't know what to do about these sorts of projects. In addition, because this is all going to start January 2nd, you will have gone through, I'm sorry to give you a course on sequestration, so stop me if you want me to stop. You have to have gone through an entire quarter of the fiscal year before all of this starts. So now the issue arises, do you want to spend more and get those contracts out in the first quarter with the risk that some of them will get cut and you'll be sued for termination liabilities? We're still fighting the A-12 in court, and that was approved by Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney. So that's a couple of years ago. So do you do that? Or do you hold back because that way you have a larger denominator from which to take this $55 billion? But if you hold back, there may be some critical programs that will never get started. These are huge dilemmas, and most of the contracting officers seem inclined to just sit on their hands because they, why take the risk? One other point, and then I'll turn over to my co-teacher on sequestration. There is a thing called the WARN Act, W-A-R-N. In Congress passed this law, I forget when, not too long ago, and it requires employers to inform potential people being RIFed. They might not necessarily be RIFed, but if they could be RIFed, they need to be informed a minimum of 60 days before that happens. In some states, it's 90 days. I think in some states, it's even 120. 60 days before January 2nd is November 2nd. 4 days before Election Day. Now, according to the bipartisan policy study that I was part of their defense task force, that study, the staff came up with an estimate based on CBO's estimate of about 1 million people being subject to RIFs in the next couple of years if sequestration happens. At least half of those are going to be defense folks. That also means that the other half are going to be non-defense folks, and there are an awful lot of people out there, working for God knows who, Coca-Cola or, General Electric or whatever, who don't realize that if this happens and the economy drops by about 0.5% of GDP, which is what's predicted, they're going to be getting pink slips, and they're not expecting them. And they'll get them 4 days before the election being told, you might be fired in 60 days. I wouldn't want to be a politician running for office 4 days before those notes go out. But for defense, it'll be an absolute disaster. Secretary Panetta has made that as clear as any. That's a good.
It's also a disaster from the strategy point of view. When the department did the new strategic guidance at the beginning of this year, we went through a lot of different strategy alternatives. And I think one of the insights that came out of that work is that you push much beyond the current Budget Control Act numbers, and you start to take very fundamental risks with this country's security in terms of our ability to make good on alliance commitments in more than one place at a time, to deal with aggression in different places and so forth. So I think there's some very fundamental strategy questions that come up when you push into the zone of sequestration that I do think put our leadership role at risk and our national security at risk. So, from that point of view, I think it's deeply disturbing. I also think there's another element of this that we have to take account of. When you go abroad and you hear the narrative of U.S. decline, which I personally reject, but when you hear that, people are keying off not just our current economic situation, they're keying off the political paralysis and the failure to govern that they are seeing from this Congress and in this country. And that, more than anything else, is what is feeding the narrative of U.S. decline. We have to be able to, to work our way through this set of issues and to come to some very pragmatic, common sense solutions. I think, you have a situation right now where political ideology is trumping one of the finest traditions of the United States of America since our founding, since the negotiation of our Constitution. And that is pragmatic political compromise to solve the problems of the nation and move us forward. That is the thing that is really needed right now. And it's not only needed domestically, but the world's watching, and they're drawing conclusions that are very harmful to our capacity to lead in the future unless we don't get after this and do it in a way that avoids sequestration.
With that, we'll open it up for your questions. As a reminder, please start, whoa, lots of hands flew right up. Please state your name, your affiliation, and especially because there are so many hands, no, standing up does not help.
Good for you.
And please, a very succinct question in the back on the aisle. Microphones will be coming to you.
Can't hear you.
Joe Bosco, DOD, under both of you undersecretaries. A privilege to have worked with both of you. Question on your exchange on the U.S. commitment to the Asia-Pacific and the apparently diminishing naval capabilities. Doug makes the case that the number of ships has diminished to the point where we may not be able to meet those capabilities. Michèle indicates that our actual capabilities are stable and maybe a little higher. My question is, what's happening in China as our vector moves in a stable plateau or even a little higher? China is moving dramatically in a number of areas that affect our own capacities. So how do you rank the relative direction of the two vectors?
So China is obviously modernizing its military in very substantial ways. Most worrisome, it is not being as transparent as we would like it to be in terms of helping us understand exactly why it's doing what it's doing and what its broader strategy is. Clearly, they're growing their naval capacity. My point was that the only metric should not be the number of ships in the fleet. Yes, the fleet's being rebalanced to put more of our overall ships into the Asia-Pacific region. But I'm as interested as what's on those ships. What are the capabilities that ensure that we can operate effectively, maintain our freedom of maneuver and action, and support our alliance commitments in the face of an increasingly contested, congested global commons, in the face of anti-access and area denial threats. So one of the things that was done in this recent budget is a laser beam was focused on all of the capabilities that are going on to those platforms, not only on ships, but in other platforms as well, to ensure that we maintain that freedom of action in a more contested environment.
Well, this gives me an opportunity to come back on the naval issue. First of all, I agree it isn't just the number of ships, but it's sort of like Lanchester's law, those of you who are familiar with that. At some point, numbers do count. And if you are spread thin around the world, and I believe that whether it's 280 ships, and if you just look at the numbers, we're not building enough ships each year to sustain that number or come even close to it. And you want to maintain your commitments in the Middle East, in the Indian Ocean, and you want to maintain them in the Mediterranean, and you have commitments there now as well with missile defense ships and so on, you're not going to hack it. That's number one. Number two is you have to look at the actual force mix. And the mix is not very reassuring. It's true we've kept our carriers. We've got an issue as to whether we can continue to build SSNs, nuclear attack submarines, at the same rate as we have in the past. We're building a significant number of ships, but those are littoral combat ships. And when I was comptroller and approved those ships for the first time, the understanding was those were not going to be your big-time warships that were going to face off against, a powerful Navy. Those were for a very different mission. So yes, we're building a chunk of those, but they don't exactly replace Aegis destroyers. Now, to get to the China question, the one reassuring thing is that they're starting from a low base. On the other hand, what's not reassuring is how fast they're moving. And Michèle is absolutely right. They don't want to be transparent at all. You want to know about our program, you can find that out without leaks. You can find out about an awful 90% of what we're up to. You probably find out about 10% of what the Chinese are up to. They don't want to give their budget numbers. They don't want to give their program information. And they're doing themselves a lot of harm. If they wanted to reassure us, the best way to do it would be to be open about it. But they're not, and they're scaring all their neighbors. They've made some huge diplomatic mistakes with a lot of their neighbors in the last couple of years. Michèle can, of course, talk at great length about that. She had to cope with that, and I think she coped with them pretty well. But the Chinese are clearly flexing their muscles in a way that worry a lot of people. I personally believe it's unnecessary. I don't think we're in a Cold War situation like we were with the Soviet Union. But you listen to some of these Chinese generals, and you do get worried.
Okay, I was probably a little harsh in my comment on the standing up, so why don't you ask the next question?
That's what's called a makeup call.
Journalists are used to standing up asking questions. Mike Macetic from the NewsHour. Secretary Flournoy mentioned our commitments to our European allies. What about their commitments to us? I'm just back from there, and you have one of the few countries that projects power. Britain is on a strategic defense review that seems to have little to do with defense. There's only one story going on over there, is the collapse of the euro. I mean, is Secretary Gates's prediction of a totally hollow European defense already coming to pass, and what is the effect of that going to be on our capabilities?
Yeah, look, I think we are all deeply concerned about the euro crisis and its impacts more broadly, but particularly on the defense spending of our closest allies in Europe and, frankly, among our closest allies in the world. When we go to Libya, our NATO allies come with us. When we go to Afghanistan, our NATO allies come with us. We have a great stake in how they manage their way through this crisis, and I, for one, am deeply concerned about the plummeting defense spending across the continent. Very few economies or very few countries are meeting the sort of basic NATO standard, which is fairly modest, of 2% GDP spending on defense. Percentage of GDP is not always, the best metric, but it is a benchmark that the alliance has adopted, and very few of them are meeting it. So I think we should be, both for economic reasons and frankly looking even longer term for demographic reasons, You know, our closest allies in Europe and Asia are among the most quickly aging populations and countries that are not always maintaining a robust level of defense spending. So I do think it's a major strategic issue. I can just assure you that certainly, you know, I'm now 3 months out of date, but certainly in my time in the administration, it was a very frequent, candid, and priority topic of conversation with our allies.
All I'll add to that, and I totally agree with that, and remember that in 1952, the NATO allies said they were going to produce dozens of divisions, which never materialized. Then it became 3% in the 1970s, and that never materialized. Yeah. So, you know, we keep drawing the line, okay, if you won't do this, at least do this, and they never meet it. There's one other thing, too, and this goes to what Dave Barno said in his opening remarks. There are a lot of people in this country who don't understand why we spend money on defense, why we're out there. And when they see our European friends living quite well, even in Greece, and not spending money on defense, while our kids are getting killed. Now, yes, they make a contribution, but the numbers, the differential in Afghanistan, in Iraq, is staggering. I know because I was the troop raiser for Iraq and Afghanistan. It was one of my additional duties. It was almost like a second full-time job. And, you know, our British friends made significant contributions. Several others did as well. Relative to their population, some of the smaller Baltic countries did the same. Our Australian friends did the same. But if this spending continues on a downward trend, all it does is reinforce the worst isolationist instincts in the United States. And that would be a disaster.
I'd add one point to that on the military side, and with two sons in uniform who've served in Afghanistan, I see this through their eyes as well, is that the value of NATO that was very apparent to my generation of military officers from having served in Europe and having faced off with the German Army, the British Army, the Canadian Army in Europe against the Warsaw Pact. That's a very different perspective than the one that's seen by our junior officers that have served in Afghanistan with our allies today. And the allies are out there, but we all, you know, our officers and NCOs, you know, see them playing at a much lower level with many constraints on what they're willing to do, and with a tiny fraction of their military capabilities being employed in Afghanistan, where significant portions of ours are there. And that's very contentious, but their view of NATO, I think, is going to be colored very negatively by their experience of the last 7, 8, 9 years in Afghanistan in particular. And I think that has knock-on effects down the road.
And they're going to come home, and they're going to talk to their friends and neighbors. And the reservists who've been out there, who are really part of their communities, are going to come home and talk. And that is what worries me. So on this one, I'm totally in agreement with Michèle.
You know, I must say, I am deeply concerned about the defense spending picture. I think it's a much more complicated picture in Afghanistan. I think that, you know, it's very much, you know, place by place, experience by experience. I think our allies, certainly for the most recent surge, stepped up in a great, certainly in numbers. I think many of the countries are serving in, you know, with quality forces and actually have been very good partners. I think it's uneven. So I think there's some people who are going to come home with that perspective that you described, General Barno, and I think others are going to come home and say, you know, I had the most amazing, you know, partners alongside me, and they were right there with me every step of the way, and so forth. So I would hate for us to walk away from here generalizing about the experience of working with NATO, certainly in Afghanistan and also in Libya.
One small follow-on to that that's also going to be a factor in the future is as we pull our forces out of Europe, the number of American military forces exposed to our European allies serving in Europe, working with them, is going to plummet from what we've seen for the last 40 or 50 years.
Actually, I would contest that, because I think one of the designs of increasing the U.S. commitment to the NRF and substituting, instead of having the one brigade there, having a rotational battalion going through, it's going to be a different battalion with each rotation. And over time, you're actually going to expose more American soldiers to the experience of working with NATO partners than just those who are in that brigade.
I just want to also make clear, I'm not talking about the quality of the people who were in Afghanistan. What I saw when I spoke to them and saw them, and also in Iraq, these were top quality people. It's not the issue. The issue is the numbers were low, relatively speaking. And secondly, when you look out in the future and you see this reluctance to spend money on their own defense, that is going to bite back home. And I don't think, I would say 90% of the people in this room would be very concerned about that, as we are at this table.
Let me just add one final thing on that. We tend in defense circles to think a lot about the military contributions of allies and what they bring to the table, but frankly the most important thing that US allies and partners bring to the table is political legitimacy for our operations. And so there are always these kinds of operational trade-offs. There will continue to be. They may get exacerbated as the defense budgets of some of our allies and partners decline, but that doesn't mean we're not going to be working with them in military operations in the future. We have a question from Twitter.
This question is actually directed to Secretary Flournoy. A Twitter user wants to know how Pentagon officials should reconcile the policies that support security force assistance and building partner capacity with congressional lack of support for new expenditures.
In general, or expenditures in that? You know, I think this is interesting. When we just went, in the last round of budget discussions, the programs for building partner capacity were very much sort of on the chopping block going into the process. People said, you know, this is just kind of nice to have stuff that we really can't afford. But as we really opened these programs up and looked at their strategic importance and the very relatively modest investment with sort of huge dividends in terms of building relationships, building capacity of partners that would actually enable them to deal with a local security issue so that we don't always have to come in once it becomes a crisis later. You know, I think the attitude towards these changed 180 degrees, certainly within you know, that discussion, and they ended up being among the things that we're protecting most carefully. I think that perspective shift is still to be had on the Hill. I mean, I don't think these programs are as fully explained or understood as they need to be to understand what a small level of investment this is for such a big payoff when the programs are successful. So I think there's a big education effort to be done to explain the value that we're getting out of, again, reasonably modest investments. Right up here.
Kate Brannon, Defense News. I wanted to ask, the Romney campaign is talking about big increases to defense spending. And if you're in industry, if you're in the Pentagon, should you take that pledge seriously? Is it realistic in today's environment? Thanks.
My obvious question is, what are they going to cut to allow that? I mean, what's the trade-off? You know, what are we talking about here? I think in any, and I'm not just being, you know, speaking politically, I think any discussion of major increases to any aspect of federal spending at this point, you have to say what the offset is. You have to say, what are you cutting instead? Are you increasing revenues to do that? Are you taking some other money from some other part of the budget and shifting it over? I think you have to have the whole picture to be able to evaluate proposals like that.
And my understanding is that, and this is just my interpretation of it, I want to be clear about that, is that this is not going to all take place in 1 year. And it's going to be a gradual growth. And so obviously he's got a lot of other proposals that, for instance, would stimulate the economy and create jobs. Now you may agree or disagree with those proposals, but that's one of the premises behind it. If the economy expands again, then you're in a better situation to increase defense spending and other spending besides. So I think you do have to place it in a larger context than perhaps the question was framed.
In the back corner.
Brad Sweet, I'm a defense futurist with DoD. Anne-Marie Slaughter was very passionate this morning in speaking to the networked environment of the future world that we're all going to be operating in. Given that context, and given some of DOD's highs and lows with strategic influence in the past, everything from the Office of Strategic Influence to smart power and its application in Yemen recently, how should DOD be looking at strategic influence in the future and shaping future battlefields, both for hopeful allies in the future as well as potential adversaries?
I'm struggling with whether to interpret your question broadly or narrowly.
Well,
in terms
I'll give it a
information
shot.
operations or above it. Go ahead and
I wasn't here when my friend Anne Marie, who's sitting right up front, was being passionate, but I know you'll get me for that one. But I've heard Anne Marie's brief about this, and it's very, very compelling. And I think that if your question is, how do we shape, to take a term that's been used on occasion, shape the international environment given these sorts of new developments in networking? The answer is, if we want to do any shaping, we're going to have to take account of those. And we're going to have to take account of those in the way that Anne Marie talks about them. They are different. This is new. And we have to be in front of the curve. What we cannot do is fall behind the curve on this. Now, this is a very separate thing from, say, cyber warfare and something else. Your question was about shaping. Look, I'm now in business. The best way to market something is if you have a good product. The United States is the best product in the world. We've got the product. So now it becomes a question of marketing the product. And when you market something, you want to market it using the latest tools available. So that's how I think we can go ahead and continue, as we have for the last 60, maybe more years. I mean, you could go back maybe to Teddy Roosevelt when he wins the Nobel Peace Prize. We've been shaping the world for a long, long time because A, we were always at the cutting edge of the tools that allowed for the shaping, and B, we had a terrific product to sell.
One of the reasons I was struggling with your question is because you framed it in terms of what should DOD do. And I really do think this is, I think Dev's right. I do think this is a whole classic whole of government effort, and where DOD doesn't necessarily have the lead, we have a role to play, but certainly not the lead. And I do believe that we have got to get a lot better at leveraging new tools to really change the practice of statecraft. I mean, we have to operate differently. And I think this administration, and I know the previous one, has certainly had many particular experiences of this, where the old tools were not adequate to the task, and you really had to think creatively about how to get a message out, how to shape an environment, and so forth. So I think it's an important question that we'll be grappling with for some time.
I would add one other thing to this, which sort of piggybacks on what Michèle said. Maybe she didn't think of that, but it resonated with me. One of the biggest challenges when you go into government is you're living off your intellectual capital, such as it is, and it has a very, very short half-life. And the only way we can keep up with not just with the latest technological developments, but with the best way to use them, is if government is open to outside thinking. And so think tanks, universities, sometimes people say, well, all they do is generate paper. What's really important is to generate those ideas. They're not going to come from within the government. It's just not the nature of government to generate new ideas. And even when government is asked to, like DARPA or something like that, and yes, we did come up with the internet at DOD, that's not going to deal with the entire gamut of fresh ideas. Just go to Seattle and see what I mean.
Just one short follow-up on that, too, if I could. I think one of the things that's an obstacle out there today is the current generation and some degree of legislation, which really dates back decades, and policies that flow from that. So in World War II, we had a pretty clear idea of propaganda and PSYOP and how to do that, and had very good legal capabilities that allowed us to do that. That's much more muddied and confused today. And we saw that in Afghanistan in terms of could a commander make a radio broadcast or not, what's PSYOP and what's not, what's military information support operations, where does information operations start and public affairs begin. There's a range of challenges out there, not all of which can simply be changed by a new field manual.
And the networks are different. They're larger, they're more complex. were NGOs anything like as important 60, 70 years ago as they are now?
The Department of Defense, we have had the great privilege of having joint professional military education really lead the federal government in teaching strategic thinking. But those days may be over, at least at some of the senior institutions where the level of the commandants are being lowered and the prestige of the institutions are really very much in jeopardy. And I wondered if you would like to talk about that, because I think it has tremendous strategic implications to the United States as a whole.
I'll talk about that and give Michèle a chance to think about it.
Thank you, Senator.
What you're referring to, for instance, is the downgrading of the president of the National Defense University from a 3-star to a 2-star. Personally, I think this is a huge mistake, and I'll tell you why. First of all, it's a signal that professional military education, which, by the way, really is a model. I mean, I've argued for years that we ought to have that for our civilians. I don't think anybody should become an SES, Senior Executive Service Person, unless they've spent A, some time in the civil arena, and B, some time at an institution of higher education. You can get your master's or something at the age of 23, 24, and never take another class again and be responsible for high technology. It blows my mind. But when you lower the leadership of these institutions, you are sending out a signal that they're not important. And, you know, those of us who visit particularly China and meet with their think tankers and meet with their 3-star generals who run these things and the 4-star generals who are chairman of the board, believe me, the Chinese are going to go, what's going on with these folks? Is this part of this decline of the United States? I think that the ramifications of this, whoever pushed this did not think through all the 2nd and 3rd order ramifications, and I hope it can be reversed.
That specific decision aside, I do think that, you know, the biggest driver of the quality of the U.S. military has always been our people. And I think that one of the most precious aspects of the military culture is that investment in training and education over the course of an officer's lifetime or what have you. And I think that's something we have to protect, that investment in human capital. I think the brilliance of Goldwater-Nichols requiring joint experience and education is part of what, over the course of a generation, gave us true jointness in the operations and practice of the military. Now, we can always go farther, as your good report points out, but I think the jointness we do have today is very much a byproduct of that investment in education and human capital development. And I would agree that we need to make the same kind of investment and create the same kind of incentive structure for the interagency community writ large. If you tied promotion to SES to interagency experience and education, you, over the course of a generation, would get a fundamentally different level of competence and cohesion in terms of integrating all of the instruments of national power.
I agree with what you've both said, but I would go even further and say that this type of professional education, particularly for DoD, but also across the interagency, is becoming more and more vital. It's not just a matter of what we've already done. Particularly as you start entering a much more uncertain strategic environment, it's that kind of education that gives you, whether you're in the military or civilian, the tools to think about uncertainty, to be adaptive, to be able to think creatively on your feet about unanticipated problems. And so particularly as budgets decline, investing in this becomes absolutely critical to ensuring that we meet the strategic challenges of the future.
And it can be done. I mean, you know, just my small little world of, you know, being Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, when I had over 2 years to cut my budget by a total of 20%, we actually managed to fence and increase the amount of dollars we put aside for training and professional development. So if you prioritize this and you understand the relationship between investing in human capital and getting premium performance from an organization, it can be done even at a time of budget constraints.
And as a comptroller, I can tell you we could find the money. Believe me. But let me point out one other thing that's terribly important, and it goes to the question about shaping, and it goes to the tweet about assistance. One of our most successful programs was IMET, the International Military Education and Training Program. And part of that is we bring people, officers, to, say, NDU and the other service schools. That's where they get exposed to our officers, to our way of life, to our values, etc. Now, if they perceive that these schools are somehow less important to us, they're going to be less important to them. They will go elsewhere for their education. We do not have a monopoly on military schools. Many of our allies have these schools, and many countries that aren't our allies have these schools. We want to get these people to come. And it isn't exactly the best advertisement to these folks when we say, you know, budgets are tight, so we're going to give up on some of this.
I just pile on by saying there is a problem that needs to be addressed, and this was a helpful discussion to do that, but it's going to take a spotlight put on it. It's the hedge against uncertainty in the future, and we're mortgaging our intellectual capital if we're not careful.
Last question, but don't head for the exits because we still have our bold predictions to make. Last question over here. No, sorry.
Billy Birdsell from Third Way. Dr. Zakheim, you categorically said that the DoD should get out of the nation-building business because 18 and 19-year-olds are not trained for it nor particularly good at it. Admiral McRaven recently testified that special operations are in some 70-some-odd countries. Very, very few of them are 18 and 19, and I would say they are some of the best at training and working with partner nation forces, which is very much a part of nation building. And in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, where 18 and 19-year-olds are training Iraqis, or used to train Iraqis, now are training Afghans through all the programs, are doing a very fine job of that. So can you please build on what aspects of nation building you think the DoD should get out of, and who specifically should assume those roles in a high-threat environment where they don't have organic security?
You may have thought you were throwing a knuckler, but actually it's a softball. First of all, I didn't say we should get out of the business. I said we shouldn't lead it. I don't think we're very good at leading it. The Special Operations Forces are actually terrific at the training that they do. They don't, for example, do what our reservists from Iowa and Indiana do, which is to train farmers how to farm. That's not what our soft folks do. And I would argue, to use that as an example, that the Department of Agriculture ought to be doing that. The problem with the Department of Agriculture is that they've never filled their quotas in Afghanistan, and the people they send are people who know how to move inboxes to outboxes, which doesn't necessarily grow corn. And so my argument is that we need to revamp AID, and since you've given me the soapbox, I'll tell you what I've told Raj Shah. We actually should use the Special Forces model in AID. AID has some terrific people working in an office called the Office of Transition Initiatives. Those are the folks, primarily women, who work with the military, who risk their lives. Then they can't get hired by AID. They don't have the right quals. Don't ask me why, but that's the case. They're all contract hires. There are only 6 govies in all of this important office. Why not create a SOF-like progression for them so that you can actually make it like Admiral McRaven to 4-star as a deputy to Raj Shah, whoever the AID administrator is, in charge of this kind of work so that it doesn't conflict with the long-term assistance that we've always done in places like Africa and Asia and so on. That's what I'm talking about. Let us develop our capabilities. Let us not be so arrogant to think that we do it better than the EU or the Australians or the Brits or what have you, because we don't always do it better. But that is not to exclude SOF, and it's not to exclude us from doing this business. But we really need to fix a lot before we do it right.
Okay, it's bold prediction time. We're going to go down the panel, and I'd ask each of you to give me your most outrageous, bold, audacious prediction over the next 12 months looking ahead. Nora.
I don't know if this counts as audacious, but I think the defense budget is going to get cut by a lot more than $487 billion, and I think that the way that DoD is going to make up the cost savings is by cutting ground force and strength significantly from the levels that was envisaged in January.
Michèle.
I hope she's really wrong. I don't know how bold or audacious, but, well, it's bold in terms of its optimism. I predict that we will avoid, just barely, 11th hour, 59th minute, 59th second, avoid sequestration, not necessarily by having the big deal that we should have, but by some mechanism to kick the can down the road and buy time. That, however, I also predict, if I'm going to jump, that if Congress only kicks the can down the road, but doesn't actually deal with the fundamental debt issue and reach a deal that involves common sense compromise, revenues and spending constraints, that you will have a lot of first-term congressmen. You will have an incredible public backlash for people not doing their jobs in Washington, and you will have a big change over the next election.
The price of letting a lady go first is that she sometimes says what you were going to say. Those of you who are married know exactly what I mean. I also think that the sequester will not happen. I think it is really difficult to expect the Congress to do away with it between now and November. But I think the fear of what I was talking about, the impact of these pink slips, is going to get them to probably give themselves another year to work this out. Obviously, it'll depend on who's in the White House, but I think whoever is in the White House will be seized with this issue. And I would say, as part of this, don't expect defense spending to go down as much as people are saying. I think that, in part, that has to do with what's going on around the world. And while I don't think, and personally would not want us to get involved in Syria, just remember, when was the last time we predicted a war we got into? I'll stop there.
But my prediction would be the next war will not be in Asia. It will be in the Middle East, and it will be potentially as early as the next 12 months, and that the depth of defense cuts will actually be deeper, ultimately, than the deepest numbers we see with sequestration right now. With that, we'll take a 10-minute break, and please join me in a round of applause for our panel.
I hope I'm wrong, too.